5th of February of this year, Washington was one of the more severe states in terms of treating substance use disorder as a crime and continuing to maintain felony possession for any amount, including residue amounts of substances, which is actually not particularly consistent with being a more progressive state and a state that's really forward thinking around behavioral health. But then on the 25th of February, the Washington State Supreme Court issued a decision in State versus Blake that essentially threw out our entire controlled substances possession statute. And so we went from being one of the more conservative states in terms of drug policy to one of the arguably the most progressive overnight. And effectively, since the 25th of February, under Washington state law, there are no criminal penalties for possession of any amount of controlled substances, and that includes people of any age, including children. And so it's really left this void. And before that happened, several weeks before that, I had introduced a piece of legislation that would have sort of followed suit with Oregon and decriminalized possession of personal amounts of drugs with a real focus on recovery support services and treatment and person-centered care. That bill, for all intents and purposes, is dead. And we thought, okay, we'll take this up over the interim when the legislature's out of session and we'll build support. And then the Supreme Court decision happened. And so now there's sort of this vacuum because the statute was considered completely unconstitutional. And so the legislature has an opportunity to completely rethink, kind of a carte blanche, blank slate, the way that we respond to untreated substance use disorder in our community. So that's the current state, is we're having lots of intensive meetings trying to figure out how to respond to this Blake decision and what does that mean and where is the public on this? There's a lot of questions.
Now, does your bill cover things that the state Supreme Court decision does not? Like, does it fill in gaps or is it more of a codification?
Great question. So my bill did less than what the state Supreme Court did. And my bill was considered a big idea when I introduced it, but yet actually the state Supreme Court went further, and my bill would have decriminalized possession for personal amounts, but it would have maintained existing law, which was a felony above that personal use threshold. And again, the Supreme Court decision throughout the entire statute, which means adults, minors can possess any amount without any criminal penalties. So it actually went further. But I will say the Supreme Court decision was silent on anything around, behavioral health interventions, connections to services. And that's really what the heart of my bill was about moving the state forward around our response to persons with untreated substance use disorder. And so that's really where the legislature needs to come in, because the Supreme Court response was a statutory response. It didn't have anything to do with, again, treatment or recovery services at all.
So talk to us about what that's looked like in the past. I mean, in the past, it's been more of a punitive approach as opposed to this sort of treatment-focused approach. So talk to us about what drug prohibition has looked like in Washington during the war on drugs, how laws have been enforced, and who's been the most harmed by them.
Great question. So certainly, by all means, the individuals who've been most harmed by these laws have been our neighbors who are Black and brown individuals, people living in poverty, people who are using outside, and so they are more exposed to some of the searches and seizures because they don't have a home within which to contain their drug use. But what it has looked like, it's just been enormously ineffective. So, of the 9,000 individuals in Washington state that are arrested every year for this charge in the kind of the Supreme Court decision, people arrested for simple possession, only 3% of those individuals ever made their way to drug court. And so what that means is the overwhelming majority of these folks were never given any connection to services whatsoever. I think there's this really prominent public perception that somehow arrest and incarceration is a pathway to recovery. And it's not. For the overwhelming majority of folks, what happened is they would get arrested for this, a simple possession. They would spend a very short amount of time in jail. They would be released, and they'd be released from custody in severe withdrawal at very high risk of overdose and with no connection to services. Then they're given a court date to show up for this felony charge, and they frequently do not show up for the court date because they are very much still in active addiction. And again, there's been no service connection. So then they get it's a failure to appear in court, then a warrant is issued, and the process just cycles with these flits of incarceration and release. They take 6 to 12 months to resolve, and the person ends up getting no services. But what they do get is a felony conviction, which actually pushes recovery further out of reach, because we know two of the most highly correlated elements with long-term recovery from addiction are employment and housing. And you have now given somebody this mark on their back for the rest of their lives that will make it infinitely more difficult to attain employment and housing.
So talk to us a little bit more about, because it seems like the next move of the legislature is to focus on connecting people to services so that they can recover and so that they can get the help that they need. We have seen in courts across the country that when you have, for example, like drug treatment courts that connect people to services, I mean, the services might be good, but once they take a punitive approach, they end up harming people. So talk to us about how you plan to address that and how you avoid that sort of pitfall.
Great question. So our focus is really going to be on a low barrier, person-centered approach that's really driven by peers. So people who are in recovery themselves, who have lived experience of incarceration, homelessness, peers who look like the community that they're serving, and making sure that we're doing intentional recruitment of folks from BIPOC communities to serve in those roles, and that we have pay equity for the peers or recovery coaches who are doing that outreach and engagement. But there's folks may be familiar with the LEAD model, which was originally called law enforcement assisted diversion, which was actually homegrown. It came from Washington State and now has been replicated nationally. Highly effective model. And we're looking at using the key elements of that model. So sure, one part of that model does have to do with working with courts and law enforcement when that is part of somebody's story. But the model includes a whole lot that has nothing to do with the courts or law enforcement. It's really about proactive outreach to meet people where they are, whether they're in encampments or we'd like to extend it to individuals who are in emergency departments, self-referrals, family referrals, basically that kind of single point of entry or very wide front door, multiple points of entry to this system of care where you offer people that, again, that person-centered care that treats them with dignity, that meets them where they are. And you offer them that intensive case management and care coordination, and using housing first modalities when that's available and appropriate, and then connecting people to treatment resources, and then again, the recovery support services, which are one of the most underfunded parts of the substance use disorder continuum of care. That's the whole suite of services that help people stay in recovery that insurance doesn't pay for. So things like recovery housing, employment and education pathways, recovery coaching services, family support, transportation, childcare, making sure that we're really holding people no matter where they are in this disease process, no matter where they are in their recovery process, and you are continually offering them connections to services and care. And that person who is their sort of identified peer or recovery coach is their constant. Again, no matter where they are, what happens to them, that's the model that we are looking at. And yes, law enforcement can refer into that, but so can someone's mom or someone's spouse or themselves or an emergency department physician, for instance. So moving away from the models that are attached to the carceral system, kind of the drug court models, for instance.
And it sounds like much of this is probably focused on funding as opposed to sort of legislative changes necessarily. Is that correct, or am I wrong there?
Well, yes. And so we really want to create in statute, we want to make sure that what the bill that we ultimately pass as a response to the Blake decision is really heavy and meaty on behavioral health response. Because at least in Washington state, our budgets are only good for 2 years, whereas state, what's in statute is forever. And so we want to actually outline in statute, this is the direction the state should be moving. This is what science tells us. This is evidence-based. We want to legislate the science of addiction recovery and make sure that we are really putting our state on a pathway where people will see the responses that the community wants, which is more people in recovery, a reduction in property crime, a reduction in needles in parks, a reduction in overdoses. We know what works, we've just never funded it. And so we really want to create that architecture and move the state very swiftly in that direction.
So I'm curious to hear where your fellow lawmakers are on this recent state Supreme Court decision. Are they happy about it? Are they looking to change the law so that it either codifies the Supreme Court decision or moves backwards? So curious to hear what you're hearing from them, if there's any movement in sort of making it something, either changing the previous law so that it passes muster, or on the other end, the end that you're looking towards, decriminalizing drugs, and where there is support and isn't.
That's a great question. I would say it's all over the map. And part of that is because, the Blake decision came as a surprise to everybody, including the legislature. And so we hadn't necessarily done, a year's worth of an education campaign to help educate lawmakers about this issue and help break down misconceptions. Again, there is a very large misconception that arrest and incarceration is a pathway to recovery. And again, it is not for the overwhelming majority of folks, but that is people hold on to that belief. And so we haven't had the gift of time to do that kind of education with lawmakers and frankly, with the general public. And so because this sort of came like a grenade in the night, because of that, people have scattered opinion-wise all over the place. So there's certainly a group of lawmakers that are interested in simply adding the word knowingly back into the statute. And what I mean by that is the basis for the Supreme Court throwing out the controlled substances possession statute in Washington was that we were the only state that didn't require the prosecution to prove that the person knowingly had drugs on their person. And so the reason it was unconstitutional is it was sort of something passive, right? The person could say that they didn't know they had drugs on the person and the prosecution didn't have to prove that. Well, one way to remedy that would certainly be to simply reinsert or insert for the first time the word knowingly and say, okay, fine, we're going to do it exactly as we always have done, but now the prosecution has to prove the person knew they had, methamphetamine in their pocket, for instance. But there's also, so that is one camp of lawmakers. But I will say that there's a very large camp of lawmakers and the general public who believe very strongly that what we've been doing has not been working. There's about 3/4 of the Washington state population believe that the state's drug laws have been a failure, and only 9% believe that they've done a good job. So there's a general perception that it's really bad out there. What we've been doing has not been working, and it's time to try something different.
Well, thank you so much for being here today and for continuing all your great work.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it seems quite clear to lawmakers, to people who are voting for lawmakers, and even to the state Supreme Court in Washington that our war on drugs has failed. It hasn't worked. And that's why it's interesting to see what the next step is forward. I mean, we've seen in different legislatures across the country that there have been years of planning to decriminalize certain drugs, or in places like Oregon, all drugs. But we're seeing here, just like the representative said, this came from a Supreme Court decision, and now the legislature is working on how to make sure that folks get behind that decision and also move towards a different world where they're taking care of people who are impacted by substance use. And that requires a lot of work. It requires a shift from this sort of punitive approach where people who are using drugs are deemed to be in need of an arrest, to instead saying, leave the criminal system out of it and make it so that if someone is struggling with a public health issue, because that's what a substance use disorder is, if someone is struggling with that, it is the job of our lawmakers and our government and our infrastructures to give them the support that they need. And so we see that a lot of things are up in the air in Washington right now. A lot of lawmakers split, considering different decisions, different ways forward, and we can only hope that they move on the path forward that other states around the country have done, and that is to provide for this more holistic approach to treatment. So thank you so much for joining us today on the Appeal Live. You can continue to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest news. We'll see you